Good evening, everyone. How are you doing today? Can you see me? Can you hear me? Is everything working fine? All right, thank you very much for joining the live workshop. It's always more fun to know that someone is actually listening and participating. You can't hear me. Let me check. You should be able to, yeah? Yeah. I see some green light on my mic, so you should be able to hear me, Mitchell. Just double check your speakers and hopefully you can. Okay, that's good. Thank you, Xiaolu. So I hope you all had a lovely holiday. So I don't know how things work in your school. I know that in most schools in China, you have to catch up some holidays, right? And this was the case in my former school. We had let's say 4 or 5 days off, but then we had to work on Saturday or Sunday to make up for the school days we missed. But guess what? I'm very lucky because in my school we don't actually catch up those holidays, so that's good. We really had 10 days off. So yeah, pretty happy, well rested. It was good to spend some time at home with the family and relax. And I hope that you enjoyed your holiday as well. And now it's going to be a long journey until Christmas, or until the Chinese New Year. But I hope that you are full of energy to to work for 10 weeks or more in a row. Okay, so tonight we will, I don't think it's gonna be a very, very long workshop. We are only going to talk about two main A2 topics. We will talk about monopoly, which is the second market structure that we need to investigate. We analyzed perfect competition, which is one benchmark. Tonight, we're going to look at another benchmark, another theoretical market structure, not very realistic, but it exists in some industries, and I'll say a few words about that. And then we'll talk about price discrimination. So if you have already used my PPTs in the past, maybe you noticed that price discrimination and monopoly was part of one single PPT. But this year I decided to divide them because this gave the impression that only a monopolist can price discriminate, which is not true. You only need to have some market power, but for example, if you are an oligopolist, you can engage in price discrimination, even if you are operating in monopolistic competition, actually. So I felt like this was confusing to have price discrimination within the PPT on monopoly. So now, I can actually show you my screen. If you look at my folders, I decided to separate it. Okay, so 7.11 is going to be monopoly, 7.12 is price discrimination, and all documents are already on the website. Okay, so same thing, the concept cards, definitions, summaries for these two topics. It's already available, so you can download these files. Okay. Okay, let's get started. Let's talk about monopoly. Something else that I should say, again, for those who have already used my PPT, perhaps in the past, I have removed the part that relates to the regulation of natural monopolies. This used to be in that PPT last year, but because the regulation of a monopoly is definitely a form of government intervention, it made more sense to include it in the PPT about how do we fix market failure for the next chapter, government microeconomic intervention. So I also removed it from this PPT, and we will address it later in the next chapter about different instruments that the government can use to address or correct the multiple market failure that may exist. Because yes, market power is one example or one cause of market failure. So at the end of the day, this PPT on monopoly is relatively short. Let's get started. Okay, we don't need that. Right, first thing we should do is, of course, to describe it. Okay, what is a monopoly? And what I mean by describing is essentially the characteristics. There are three main characteristics. First one, of course, one single seller. We call it the monopolist, so it's important to distinguish between a monopoly, which is the market structure itself, and the monopolist, which is the firm within or inside a monopoly. Okay, the only seller, the only business in this market is called the monopolist. So, but it's also important to describe what happens on the demand side. Yes, on the supply side, there is one single seller, but it's also important to describe what happens on the demand side, because we must mention that there are many buyers. Because, for example, if you have only a few buyers, then we will not call that a monopoly. And if you have only one buyer and one seller, we would not call that a monopoly. Okay. And which means that there is no, this monopolist does not compete directly with anyone else. Okay, because it is the only seller. All right. Second characteristic, which is definitely worth mentioning, and in many textbooks they actually forget to mention that, there are no close substitutes to the monopolist's product, which means that essentially the monopolist produces something that is a bit unique, if you want. Okay, you cannot replace it by something very similar, perhaps in another market, because otherwise, as you can imagine, if the monopolist started to charge very high prices, people will just say, all right, it's too expensive, I'm going to buy a close substitute in another market. That's not possible, because there are no close substitutes. If you want to buy this product, you don't have the choice. You cannot buy it from different, you cannot choose between several substitutes, even if they are imperfect. There is one single type of product that you can produce, and it is produced by the monopolist. So for example, let's say that actually, there is a good example from a current event. I read that yesterday in the news. Apparently, a pharmaceutical company discovered an antibiotic that could be used to treat the Lyme disease. I don't know if you know what the Lyme disease is. I'm not sure if we call it this way in English. So let me check. I know it has another scientific name. Lyme disease, the tick-borne disease. Yes, okay, caused by the bacteria Borrelia burgdorferi. Okay, and if you Google it, because there is no because I don't have my VPN on, so I can't really look at the news. But yeah, it's you had it. Oh wow. So well, did you? So you actually got rid of it? Because I heard that this was usually not something that you could actually cure. You can live with it, and there are some treatments that can help you to live with it. But I read in the news that a few days ago, this lab just realized that there is an old antibiotic, something that was developed decades ago that we don't really use anymore, and they discovered that it's extremely effective, and this can actually kill the bacteria and apparently really cure those who were infected. Okay, well, good for you if you didn't get any symptoms. So why am I talking about that? Because let's say that this pharmaceutical company is the only one producing these antibiotics, okay, that can cure Lyme disease. Well, in that case, there is no close substitute. Okay, if you want to to get better, if you want to be cured, you can simply, let me share that. You can simply buy the product from that particular company. There are no close substitute. You don't really have the choice, which means that there is no indirect competition. Because think about it. Let's say that let's say that I want to go from Paris to London. Okay, or maybe let's say from Paris to Barcelona. Maybe that's better. Paris to Barcelona. And let's just assume that there is one single airline that sells ticket for you to go from Paris to Barcelona. Okay. So there is one single seller, no problem. But in this case, there are some substitutes that are relatively close. Okay. For example, you could very well go from Paris to Barcelona by high-speed train. Okay, it's not that far. You can actually do it. So we should not really, even if there is one single airline selling tickets to fly from Paris to Barcelona, we should not really regard it as a monopoly, because it still suffers from the indirect competition of high-speed train. Okay, same thing if you want to go to, let's say, from Chengdu to Guangzhou, same thing. Maybe there is a single company that sells air tickets, but if they charge very high prices, people will just say, all right, then I'm going to go there by high-speed train. So it's an important characteristic of a monopoly, no close substitutes. And finally, this market has prohibitive barriers to entry. So prohibitive means very, very high, so high that nobody can enter, essentially. It's just impossible for any new firm to break down or to tear down those barriers to entry and to enter the market, which means that there is no potential competition. Okay, it's not possible that someone is going to choose to enter and to compete with me. So it's actually a good way to summarize what happens in a monopoly: no direct, indirect, or potential competition. Okay, I like to summarize it this way, which means that the monopolist has a very, very, very strong market power, a very strong market power in this market. Something else that is worth mentioning, and that is different from perfect competition. Remember, in perfect competition, we distinguished between the market demand curve, which was a downward sloping, usually on the left-hand side diagram, and the individual demand curve facing each perfectly competitive firm. And the individual demand curve in perfect competition was horizontal, perfectly price elastic at the prevailing market price. In a monopoly, we don't need to make that difference, because of course we have one single firm, one single seller. So the demand that this firm faces, so the individual demand, is the total demand, okay, the market demand. So there is no difference between the market demand and the demand curve facing the monopolist. They are exactly the same, and it's important to understand that. And because we usually have market demand curves that are downward sloping, of course, usually demand is downward sloping, law of demand, then that means that the average revenue of the monopolist is decreasing. What does it mean? It means that if the monopolist wants to sell more output, well, it has to reduce the price. It has to cut the price, okay? And that's actually why we say that the monopolist is price maker, okay? Unlike perfectly competitive firms who were price taker, okay? They had no influence on the market price whatsoever. It doesn't matter how much output they wanted to sell. Perfectly competitive firms were just too small compared with the overall size of the market to influence the market price. But a monopolist, of course, will choose the price. The price will simply depend on how much they want to sell. If they want to sell a low level of output, they will charge a high price. And if they want to sell a large level of output, they will charge a lower price. And remember, when we studied revenue curves, I explained that if we have a demand curve that is downward sloping, then the marginal revenue is going to be lower than the average revenue, because of course, if we want to sell one more unit, we have to cut the price on all units. Okay, there was what we sometimes call what I like to call the bad news and the good news. Okay, if you decrease the price, the good news is that you sell one more unit. Okay, so that's like a quantity effect. Your total revenue increases because you sell a greater level of output. But the bad news, what is going to reduce your total revenue, is that now all previous units that you sold at a higher price, now you sell them at a lower price. All right. So yes, in a monopoly, the marginal revenue is smaller than the average revenue. And you remember graphically that the marginal revenue has the same vertical intercept as the average revenue, but it is twice steeper. And Mitchell, you make a very good point. Caitlin, sorry. What if demand is price elastic? Absolutely, because eventually the extent to which a monopolist can take advantage of its dominant position, because yes, it has a dominant position, it has a very strong market power, it is the only seller, no potential competition, no indirect competition, so very strong market power. But then there is a difference between having a dominant position and taking advantage of a dominant position. Okay, essentially, some people have a lot of power, but not all of them are going to take advantage of that power for their own interest. And that's the same thing for a monopoly. They have a dominant position, but whether or not they will be able to take advantage of it and, let's say, charge a very high price or a much higher price than if the market was competitive, depends on the price elasticity of demand. And actually, there is, I can write it in the previous version of my PPT. I talked about it. There is something that we call the learner index. I don't know if this is what you are talking about, Caitlin. The learner index that tells you that the price of the monopoly minus the marginal cost divided by the price is equal to 1 over the price elasticity of demand. You can prove it. Doesn't really matter. So essentially, price minus marginal cost, it's the extent to which the monopolist can charge a price that is above the marginal cost. Okay. So if you have a very strong market power, the price is going to be much higher than the marginal cost. So this ratio is going to be quite big. Okay. But if you have, if the price you charge is very low, close to the marginal cost, the left-hand side is going to be quite small. And here you can prove that it is equal to the price elasticity of demand. So basically, this means that if demand is very, very elastic, so the PED is very large, then it means that what we call the markup, so the markup is the difference between the price and the marginal cost, is going to be very low. So the monopolist, in order to maximize its profit, will charge a price that is very close to the marginal cost. And in that case, the dead weight loss will be actually quite small. But if demand is very inelastic, so if the PED is close to 0, then 1 over something very close to 0 is something very big, which essentially means that there will be a very big markup. That the extent to which the price will be larger than the marginal cost is going to be very significant. The monopolist will take advantage of the fact that the demand is very inelastic to charge very, very high prices. So it's a very good point to mention that at the end of the day, whether the price charged by the monopolist is going to be high or low depends on the price elasticity of demand. The monopolist will charge a very high price if it faces a price inelastic demand, and it will charge a relatively low price if it faces a very price elastic demand. Yes. I think this is what you had in mind, right? And you can actually graph it. If you graph it, if you make the demand very elastic, you will see that the price is going to be quite low. But if you make the demand very steep, very inelastic, the price is going to be very high. But since we assume no closed substitute, this suggests that the demand is likely to be inelastic, right? Because you know that the number of substitutes is something that makes the more substitutes you have, the more elastic the demand. So the fact that there are no close substitutes, well, indicates that it's more likely that the demand is going to be quite inelastic. Yeah, that's okay. So that's exactly. If there is no close substitute, can we say demand for monopolistic products is relatively inelastic? It's likely to be, yes. It's very likely to be. Because the number of substitutes is an important determinant of the PD. Of course, it's not the only one. So we cannot say that it's always going to be inelastic, because it depends on the other factors. Okay, the other determinants of the PD depends on the time, how much time you allow, how much time you give consumers to adapt to price changes. It depends on the budget coefficient. What percentage of your income do you spend on the product produced by the monopolist? All this depends on the level of brand loyalty, all these factors that have an influence on the PD. And overall, whether the demand is going to be elastic or inelastic is just the combination of all these factors. But yes, because no close substitute, it's likely to be relatively inelastic. Okay. And if you want to, because it's actually a very good point that you put forward, Caitlin. If you want to look into it, just type a learner index. And I hope I did not tell you two stupid things, because I haven't reviewed that for some time, but essentially, all right. Okay, I was not too far. Price minus marginal cost divided by price is 1 over the price elasticity of demand. So you can have a look at like this type of article, which exactly explains what you said. That the more inelastic the demand, the greater the markup. Markup is P minus MC. So yeah, that's correct. Okay, so this is reviewing. Okay, that's just the revenue curves of a monopolist. So the blue line is the demand curve. Red line is the marginal revenue. And of course, when MR is 0, total revenue is maximized. No problem. We've already seen that. Okay, so how about the equilibrium of the monopoly? So I can actually do it directly from the diagram. I think it's easier to explain it from the diagram and then to summarize it with the text. That's usually what I do with my students. I start with the diagram and then I summarize with the previous slides. All right, so I have my cost curves, ATC and the marginal cost. Okay, this is my demand curve, downward sloping, the average revenue, and this is the marginal revenue curve, same vertical intercept, twice steeper. Like in any market structure, the monopolist maximizes profit when MC is equal to MR. Okay, so this is the quantity that maximizes the monopolist's profit. And make sure that your students don't make that silly mistakes of saying that, all right, I have the quantity, then I can find the price very easily. The price is there. Okay, that's of course a mistake. This is not the price that the monopolist should charge to sell this quantity. If the monopolist charged this price, the quantity demanded would be, I don't even know where this would be. Let me just, I don't know, somewhere here, right? We don't want to sell this quantity, do we? We don't want to sell this quantity. We want to sell QM. So this is not the price, clearly not. If we want to find the price, the market price that we should charge to sell this particular quantity, we have to, we start from QM, the profit maximizing quantity of output, and we read the demand price, okay? The demand price at this level of output, which is the price at which the quantity demanded is equal to QM, okay? We want to charge the maximum price such that buyers will be willing and able to purchase exactly this quantity, okay, PM. We could even identify the profit, okay? So profit, price minus average total cost times quantity. So same thing, I can find the average total cost by looking at where the average cost is at QM. Okay, the average total cost is right there. I start from QM. I go up until I find the average cost and I read its value. All right. So then the profit is just, so of course, the difference between the price and the average total cost, we call that the per unit profit, no problem, or the average profit. And if I multiply by the quantity, I get the total profit. Okay. Pi, capital Pi is for profit. Pi M. Something else that I like to do, and I think we are ready to do that, because in A2 we have already talked about efficiency. So it's a good occasion to talk about, okay, are we going to have productive efficiency? Are we going to have allocative efficiency? So productive efficiency, clearly we don't, okay, because we know that it's achieved at the minimum of the average total cost curve. So if we wanted to achieve productive efficiency, we would need to produce QPE, this level of output, which is not the case. So generally speaking, a monopoly will not achieve productive efficiency. All right. Do we have allocative efficiency? No, again, we don't. Allocative efficiency is achieved when the marginal cost of production is equal to the marginal benefit of consumption. And remember that the marginal benefit of consumption is just given by the demand curve. All right, that's it. That's your marginal benefit of consumption. So clearly, again, allocative efficiency is achieved at this level of output, QAE, okay, marginal cost, marginal benefit, problem. And this is not the level of output produced by the monopolies. So we do not have allocative efficiency, which means that we do not maximize total surplus, and therefore there will be a deadweight loss. And the deadweight loss is represented by this yellow shaded area. That's the difference between the marginal benefit and the marginal cost from the level of output produced by the monopolist to the allocatively efficient level of output. All right. So clearly, if we look at this diagram, we have a problem of under provision where the market does not allocate enough resources to the production of that particular good or service. Basically, the price is too high, so consumers don't buy enough, and we don't produce enough. Okay, so we have the deadweight loss. So I think this diagram is very interesting because it summarizes a lot of information. Okay, the optimum output rule, the fact that the relationship between AR and MR, how we can identify a profit, and also some consequences in terms of economic efficiency. So I feel like this is a pretty comprehensive diagram, and I like to use it a lot. It's also an update since last year. I did not have this diagram in my PPT last year. Okay, so now we are ready to summarize, and that's usually how I do it. Okay, so I start by reminding everyone what is the optimum output rule true in any market structure. MC is equal to MR. Okay, then how do we find the price? And something that is quite interesting, and I remember there was one MCQ about that, so your students should definitely pay attention to this. It's an interesting property of the equilibrium of a monopoly is that at the equilibrium, we are on the price elastic section of the demand. Okay, how can we see that? Well, remember, if I continue this, if I continue the marginal revenue curve a little bit, if I keep drawing it, let's try to do something like that. Okay, not too bad. All right, so it would cut the horizontal axis somewhere here. Okay, so if you look at this this level of output over there, this one, when MR is equal to 0, we know that this is the level of output at which total revenue is maximized. Yes, but we also know that this is the level of output at which the PD is equal to 1. Okay, in absolute value. This is the point, the level of output at which demand is unit elastic, which means that all quantities below this level are such that the demand is price elastic. Okay, and all quantities larger than this level of output are such that demand is inelastic. Okay, because the PED decreases along the demand curve. And the equilibrium of a monopoly will always be to the left of this point. Okay, that's what I call QTR. QTR, because this is the quantity of output that maximizes the total revenue. And QTR. Okay. QM is always going to be smaller than QTR, which means that the demand will always be price elastic at the equilibrium of the monopoly. And yes, I remember there was an MCQ about that. So that's why I feel like it's important to mention it. Okay, and you have the explanation here. All right, that's the consequence. It follows that the demand is locally price elastic at QM. PD is greater than 1 at this level of output, because the quantity produced by a monopolist who intends to maximize its profit is less than the quantity that should be produced to maximize total revenue. Always, this is always true, as long as the marginal cost is positive, always true. Okay, and finally, in terms of efficiency, so we saw it clearly, we saw that allocative is not going to be achieved, and actually it's never going to be achieved in a monopolist, and we will always have a problem of under provision where the monopolist is not going to produce enough. Okay, so not enough resources allocated to production, so that's why the market fails. Okay, so of course this is assuming that there are no economies of scale. I'll talk about the importance of economies of scale a bit later. So yes, there is a deadweight loss. Total surplus is not maximized. And we saw that on the diagram. Same thing for productive efficiency. Productive efficiency is not going to be achieved. Of course, there could be a very weird case. It's possible if you have your marginal cost curve, marginal revenue curve that happens to cut the ATC curve exactly at the minimum of the ATC curve, then yes, you would have productive efficiency, but this is a very special case. So generally speaking, you do not have productive efficiency in a monopoly. So that's quite bad. No allocative efficiency, no productive efficiency. So we definitely do not have economic efficiency. Okay. Questions? No questions? All right, so now something that is quite useful, especially, well, this I can skip. It's going to be useful. These are just reminders of consumer surplus and producer surplus and total surplus, simply because I'm going to compare perfect competition and monopoly. So, but we've already studied that in AS, and I usually already summarize it when we study efficiency. So I think I can skip that, right? But if you feel like your students need to be reminded about consumer surplus and producer surplus, well, you can include this, but I'm going to skip this. All right. What we are going to do is this. Now we are going to compare the equilibria of a monopoly versus the equilibrium in perfect competition. And the way I tell a story to help my students better understand. So first, chapter 1, if you want, let's assume that we have a market that is perfectly competitive. All right, so if we have a market that is perfectly competitive, we would have something like that, right? Supply demand, that's perfect competition. The equilibrium, P star, Q star, the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, the total surplus. Okay, and of course, no deadweight loss, because the supply curve is the marginal cost of production. The demand curve is the marginal benefit of consumption. At the market equilibrium, they are equal. So allocative efficiency is achieved. Total surplus is maximized. There is no deadweight loss. Okay, so this is our benchmark. Okay, we start from there. That's chapter 1. But then let's just assume then all firms merge. So of course, if you have all the firms within this market who decide to merge, well, then the market becomes a monopoly, right? You have one single seller. Okay. And then what happens? And to simplify, we will make this simplifying assumption. We will assume that when those firms merge, the marginal cost curve of this new big firm, this new monopolist, is simply the supply curve. And actually, it's quite realistic. But let's not enter into detail. So, okay, so this is what we had in perfect competition. Now let's assume that they merge. Okay, so we still have the same demand curve, of course. When we have moved from perfect competition to monopoly, the demand curve has not changed. So now the demand curve becomes the average revenue of the monopolist. I can also graph the marginal revenue. Okay, of course. And you see that when moving from perfect competition to monopoly, the supply curve, the market supply curve in perfect competition simply becomes the marginal cost of the monopolist. It makes sense because, just to explain very quickly, because the supply curve in perfect competition is just the horizontal sum of the marginal cost of all individual funds. So that's why it makes sense. I repeat, the market supply curve in perfect competition is simply the horizontal sum of the marginal cost of all individual perfectly competitive firms. So yes, that's essentially the same thing. Okay, so now in the monopoly, so same thing, the firm wants to maximize its profit, MC is equal to MR. Okay, so we produce this quantity of output, we charge this price. And again, what I can do now is to identify the consumer surplus, all right, over there, the producer surplus over here, okay, and the sum of the two, the total surplus, okay? So I started to look at what happens in a perfectly competitive market, supply is equal to demand, boom. Now they all merge, this becomes a monopoly, and I do the same thing. I find the equilibrium quantity, the equilibrium price, and I identify consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. Okay. Now I can compare. So let's just use a single diagram. Okay. You see, I have represented the two equilibria. So this one, P star, Q star, this is the perfectly competitive equilibrium. And PM, QM, this is the equilibrium of the monopoly. So what do we see? First, we see that the price is higher in a monopoly. Okay. And the quantity is lower, all right? And that's always going to be true, again, unless there are substantial economies of scale, but we will leave the economies of scale for later. Let's just ignore them for now, okay? So higher price, lower output, all right. Consumer surplus also decreases, okay? Initially, the consumer surplus in perfect competition was this big area, okay? Now it's only this smaller area. So consumers, they are definitely made worse off. This is what they lose, okay? This area represents the consumer surplus that they used to have in perfect competition and that now is part of the producer surplus in a monopoly. And this triangle used to be consumer surplus and now it's just lost, okay? It no longer belongs to consumer surplus and it has not been hijacked by the monopolist either. So it's just lost. How about producer surplus? So this was producer surplus in perfect competition. Okay, this big triangle. This is producer surplus in the monopolist, for the monopolist. Okay, you could prove that it's always bigger. If well, it's always bigger. Yes, you can prove it. I'm not going to do it, but it's always bigger. Yes. So if we compare producer surplus, so the monopolist has gained this. Okay, and has lost this. So clearly what was gained is much bigger than what was lost. Okay, and that's always going to be the case. Why? Because profit is maximized at QM. So you cannot do better than the producer surplus that you have at QM. That's why it's always smaller in perfect competition. It cannot be any bigger. This area is always smaller than this area. Always. Okay, so, okay, and if I summarize, if I try to say, okay, so overall, what happens? Well, area A plus area B, that represents the loss in consumer surplus, okay? Area A minus area C, this is the change in producer surplus. And overall, the change in total surplus, I can just add these two. Okay, so minus A plus A, that cancels out. So that's just minus C minus B, this, which is the deadweight loss. This is the deadweight loss that is caused by the market power of that monopolist. Okay, so what lesson can we learn from that? Well, the monopoly price is higher, the monopoly output is lower, the producer surplus is larger, the consumer surplus is lower, and the total surplus is lower as well. And yes, assuming that there are no economies of scale, nothing that can offset this market failure, this is what we're going to find when we compare a perfectly competitive equilibrium and the equilibrium in the monopoly. Does it make sense? Yes? Should be fine, right? So that's how I present it. That's how I introduce it. That's how I compare monopoly versus perfect competition. And let me just say something about essay questions, because there are very often some essay questions where students are expected to compare these two market structures. And a very common mistake is that first they say everything they know about perfect competition, then they say everything they know about monopoly, but they don't compare them, right? They just introduce them separately, but they never say, all right, so in which case the price is going to be higher, in which case the quantity is going to be higher, something like that. They never bring them together. Yeah, they just introduce them separately. That's not a comparison. This diagram that we have right there is a good comparison, okay, because we have the two equilibria on the same diagram. So I strongly suggest that students use this diagram if they are expected, if they intend to compare these two market structures. Okay. All right. Good. So there are essentially only three things now that we have to do to finish this topic. We have to talk about X inefficiencies. We have to talk about dynamic efficiency, and we have to talk about economies of scale. All right, and I think that's it. And then we'll talk about price discrimination. X inefficiency, what is it? The idea is relatively simple. Basically, a monopolist faces no competition, and therefore it might become lazy. What do I mean by lazy? Basically, in that context, it means that it might not do everything it can to produce at the lowest possible cost. If you face a very strong competitive pressure, it is a matter of life and death to keep your costs as low as possible, okay? Because if you fail to produce at the lowest possible cost, you will lose market shares and you are likely to go bankrupt. Okay, so essentially, in French, we say that you have the knife under your throat. I don't know if there is an expression like that in English, but basically, yeah, you have to do everything you can to produce in the most efficient way to keep your costs as low as possible. Otherwise, you might just die as a business. But for a monopolist, with no direct competition, no potential competition, no indirect competition, even if they do not produce at the lowest possible cost, it's no big deal because they have such a strong market power that they can simply charge a high price to compensate for the high cost of production, and they can survive and they can even make an abnormal profit in that case. And why is this a problem? Because remember that economics is all about resources. And if we do not produce at the lowest possible cost, this means that we have wasted resources. It is as simple as that. And this is something that is likely to happen. Big firms that face little competition in very concentrated market structures, and especially monopolists, they tend to use more resources than necessary to produce any given level of output. So they waste resources. When we talked about efficiency, that's the first topic. Let me just again share my screen. This is something that we talked about technical efficiency. Not here, week 7. Yes. Let me just reopen very briefly the PPT on efficiency. I didn't talk about it because this was one step further, so I skipped it. Yes, but I talked about technical efficiency, and I said technical efficiency is achieved when a firm produces the greatest possible level of output for any given combination of inputs, which means it's equivalent to say that it produces any given level of output at the lowest possible cost. Okay. And X inefficiencies is the same as technical inefficiency. Okay? In the case of a monopolist, you use more resources than what you actually need to produce a given combination or given a level of output. Okay, so it's definitely related, and this would be something like that. Okay, for example, you have 10 workers, but they do not produce as much as they could. So this would be technically inefficient. So there is a very close relationship between X inefficiencies and technical inefficiency. Okay, X inefficiency is really a particular case, a particular type of inefficiency that is about those large businesses who become lazy because they face low competition. Technical inefficiency is a bit more general. Okay, there are several reasons for which firms can be technically inefficient. All right. All right, so it's about the absence of competitive pressure. Usually the example that I give them to understand, to illustrate it, I often talk about sports competition. Now, if you have a very, very strong, let's say, football team that plays against a very, very weak football team, well, it's likely that the players of the very, very strong football team, they will not play their best football, okay? Because they know that no matter what, they are going to win the game. So, you know, they don't need to do much to win. So they are not going to produce the best possible game, essentially. And that's really the same thing with large businesses who face low competitive pressure. So yeah, so the consequence is that the average cost of a monopolist tends to be higher than the average cost of a perfectly competitive fund. And we call that X inefficiency. That's how you can graph it. Okay, so this would be this red U-shaped curve would be the ATC of a monopoly. And the green curve is the ATC of a perfectly competitive firm. The green curve is lower because in perfect competition, you must keep your costs as low as possible if you want to survive. What's the information in the boxes here? K is the number of machines. L is the number of workers. Essentially, this means that if you want to produce 10 units of output, let's say 10 cars, a firm in perfect competition who wants to keep costs as low as possible would manage to do it with only 5 machines and 9 workers. And so that's the lowest possible cost. But a monopolist might actually use 5 machines and 10 workers. Okay, so basically this means that there is 1 worker that is not necessary. You could produce the same output with fewer resources. And of course, it's a problem because the average cost is going to be higher for a monopolist, which might translate into a higher price for consumers. And the difference here is PL, which is the price of labor, that would be the wage, divided by 10. Okay, that doesn't really matter. But this would be the difference in average cost if we hire 1 worker that is not useful, that is not necessary for the production process. Cost inefficiency, again, it varies a lot from one definition to the other, Caitlin, and that's a bit of a problem. Cost inefficiency, at least the way that I use it in my PPTs, it's about how you combine your resources, whether you have the best possible proportion of capital and labor. because you know that especially in the long run, there are several ways you can produce the same level of output with many workers and few machines, or many machines and few workers. So cost efficiency is about finding the best combination of inputs to produce at the lowest possible cost. So it's about combining resources. Technical efficiency is using more resources than necessary. It's not really about the proportion of capital and labor in this example. It's more about the quantity of resources overall. Do we really need 10 workers and 5 machines to produce 10 cars? No, we need less than that actually. If we really tried to keep costs as low as possible, we could produce 10 cars with only 5 machines and 9 workers. That's why there is a difference between cost and technical efficiency. Cost efficiency, the best combination of capital and labor, essentially, the best proportion. Technical efficiency, using the least amount of resources possible. Yes, okay. It's true, but what matters here is not really the proportion of capital and labor. What matters here is the overall quantity of resources that we use. I'm not saying, for example, it's not like, let me just modify it slightly, Caitlin, so maybe it's going to be more clear. It's not like if I had something like that. Okay, if I had something like that, you see that from this point to this point, here I have less machines, but more workers, more machines, less workers. So again, maybe in that case, this could be a problem of cost inefficiency, where you do not have the right combination. So here you would have not enough machines and too many workers. So here you would substitute capital for labor. You would get more machines and fewer workers. All right. And in this case, you would improve cost efficiency, or you would achieve cost efficiency. Here, you don't substitute capital for labor. It's just that you add 1 unit of labor that is not useful, essentially. So it's not really the proportion. It's not really the proportion of capital and labor. You just use too many resources. 1 worker is basically useless. You waste it. You waste your worker. That's the key point. But that being said, technical efficiency and cost efficiency are not tested in A2. And as I mentioned it when I delivered the workshop on efficiency, you should not teach technical efficiency and cost efficiency to your students, or at least you do whatever you want, but I do not do it. I skip it and I just focus on X inefficiency. Okay, right. Let's say a few words about dynamic efficiency. So again, I have, just for convenience, I have copied the PPTs on static and dynamic efficiency to briefly remind students what this is about, what's the difference. Static efficiency at one point in time, dynamic efficiency over a period of time, in the short run, in the long run, you can say that. And yes, for A2, we are mostly interested in innovation. And we often say that firms are dynamically efficient if they innovate enough, if they sufficiently invest in research and development to introduce process or product innovation. Okay, they will be dynamically efficient if they do not focus too much on the present, if they attach sufficient importance to the future. Okay, that's basically the idea behind dynamic efficiency. So can we say that a monopolist is more likely to be dynamically efficient than a firm operating in perfect competition? Well, honestly, it's difficult to tell. It's a bit difficult to tell because there are 2 opposite forces. It's hard to tell. On the one hand, if you are a small business in perfect competition, you have very strong incentives to innovate, okay? Because you face very tough competition. So if you could innovate either by introducing a new process that would allow you to reduce your cost of production, or if you could find some way to innovate, improve the product quality, to differentiate your product, to have a higher quality, new features, well, in that case, you would gain a competitive advantage. You would reduce the intensity of competition, and you would be able to increase your profit. So yeah, of course, in perfect competition, very strong incentives to innovate. However, the problem that we have in perfect competition is that competition is so tough that usually businesses, they don't make a lot of profit, especially in the long run. Remember, in the long run, all firms make normal profit, zero economic profit. So it might be quite difficult for them to have enough funds to invest in research and development, to undertake those investments. So then you could say, all right, they could borrow money. Yeah, okay, they could borrow money, but again, it might be complicated because they are very, very small businesses. Banks might believe that the investment project is too risky. Okay, innovation is usually something that takes a very long time, could take several years, could cost a lot of money. So if the bank considers that this is a risky investment, it might just refuse to make loans to these very small businesses, or it might charge a very, very high interest rate. So basically, it might be expensive or complicated for a business to find the funds necessary to carry out research and development and to innovate. Okay, and that's what I mentioned here. R&D, innovating, is often something that takes time, sometimes several years. And if you are operating in perfect competition, you are very small, you face a lot of competition, your survival in the long run remains uncertain. So is this really a good idea to spend a lot of money to innovate if you might just go bankrupt in a few months or a few years, perhaps? So, of course, they have a strong incentive to innovate, but they might be unable to do it, or they might simply be hesitant to innovate. Monopolists, on the other hand, it's the opposite. They have a lot of money, or they can have a lot of money, because they can make abnormal profit even in the long run. So they could retain some of this profit to finance lengthy and costly research and development. Business risk is much lower. Okay, it's less likely that they will go bankrupt in a few weeks or in a few months because they have such a strong market power. Okay, so it's safer for them to engage in long-term projects. Yes, so they can, but because they face no competition, as we said about X inefficiencies, they can become a bit lazy. They have little incentives to introduce product or process innovation. Okay, why should we improve the quality of our product? Nobody else is competing with us. Why should we do our best to reduce our cost of production? If we are inefficient, we can simply charge a higher price. So you see that it's the opposite. They have the ability to innovate, but they might not have sufficient incentive. So, and I think this difference between perfectly competitive firms and a monopolist in terms of dynamic efficiency is very interesting. And if your students want to write an essay about these two market structure, I feel like this is a very interesting discussion to make, to just say, okay, incentive versus ability. And at the end of the day, it's hard to tell which market structure or which firms are likely to be the most dynamically efficient. Before I move on, I realized that I forgot something. I forgot to talk about the reasons for X inefficiency, right? I skipped this slide, sorry, because I started looking at the diagram right away, and I forgot to say a few words about this one. Remember, X inefficiencies, the monopolist faces no competition, so it becomes lazy, and it fails to minimize its cost of production. So you have five examples of reasons for which this may happen. I'm not going to say too much about this. This could be poor HR planning when we hire more workers than necessary. just like the diagram illustrated. This could be high material cost, could be a situation where you source raw materials from an expensive supplier. Perhaps you are used to work with a supplier, you have worked with the same supplier for years, and you just find it more convenient to keep working with the same supplier, even if it is not the one that sells the raw materials at the lowest price, okay? But because you have such a strong market power, you don't really care. It's expensive, okay, I'm just going to raise the price, and at the end of the day, consumers are going to pay for these expensive supplies. Could be political interest. So political interest is not really about becoming lazy. It's more like being able to afford being inefficient. If you are in perfect competition, you can't really afford to be inefficient because you might go bankrupt. But if we have a public monopolist, so state-owned business, they might actually choose to retain more workers than necessary, to hire many workers, even if they don't need all of them, simply because they are concerned about, well, what the population would think if the government started to lay off hundreds of thousands of workers. Okay, there could be some negative political implications. If I'm the president and the election is next year and I want to be re-elected, I should make sure that public companies do not lay off too many workers, right? Because this might make people quite upset, and then I might have some trouble to be re-elected next year. So one solution might be to just keep those workers, even if they are not really required for production. So basically, the public monopolist would accept to remain productively inefficient just to avoid upsetting some citizens for political interest. Could be lack of management control. Simply, again, firms, they do not face any competitive pressure. So it's not as important as in perfect competition to make sure that all of your workers, they achieve their full potential. It's not as important to make sure and to do everything you can to maximize labor productivity within your organization. And because of that, management can be a bit lenient, and workers can eventually start to take it easy, which means that they would not achieve their maximum productivity. And therefore, the labor cost would not be as low as possible, of course. And finally, it could be that the production process is outdated, that some equipment is obsolete, for example, perhaps because this monopolist doesn't have strong incentives to innovate, to introduce process innovation. So process innovation is something new that makes your production more efficient. Could be organizational, could be to use more machines, could be to reorganize the production process overall, new methods of production, and so on, new organization within the company. In perfect competition, it is very important that businesses, they do everything they can to innovate and to make their process as quick, reliable, cheap as possible. But again, if we have a very large organization that faces low competition, you can still survive with an inefficient production process. All right, these are just a few examples of why a business can be inefficient. It's not necessary for students to talk about all of them. Usually 3 is enough. If I had to choose 3, I would choose first one, the second one, and maybe the fourth one. I think that these are probably the easiest to explain. Okay. Good. All right, any questions at that stage? There is one last thing we have to do. We have to talk about economies of scale and natural monopoly, and then we will be done with this topic. But before we move on, do you have any questions about what we've discussed so far? No questions? Okay. All right. So briefly, that's quite easy. Let's talk about that. So of course, we often say that a monopoly is bad. Yes, because the firm has a very strong market power and it can use this market power to charge a high price. That's bad. Yes. But there can be one advantage, is that compared with many small firms, a large firm will produce a larger output. Okay, if we are in perfect competition, each firm sells a low output. Okay, but in monopoly, this business will sell a large output. And therefore, if there are substantial economies of scale within that industry, well, then this means that a monopoly will be able to produce at a lower cost, at a lower average cost than perfectly competitive firm. And this might actually be good for consumers, because with a lower cost of production, the market price might actually be lower. So of course, there are two things that we should consider. Okay, a monopoly that enjoys substantial economies of scale has a much lower cost of production and therefore has the ability to charge a lower price. Okay, but on the other hand, a monopolist has a very strong market power and it can use this market power to charge a high price or a price higher than the marginal cost. So overall, whether or not the price charged by the monopolist is going to be higher or lower than the price charged by a perfectly competitive firm, or the equilibrium price in perfect competition, it's not clear. Yeah. It's not clear. But it's possible, especially if there are very important economies of scale, that the price charged by the monopolist will be lower than the equilibrium price in perfect competition. It is possible. And in that case, well, that's actually going to be very good. Consumer surplus is going to be much higher in that case. It's very good news for consumers. So yeah, yes, so monopolist operates at a very large scale of production. And therefore, yes, a monopolist will be able to produce at a lower cost than many small firms. Mm-hmm. We actually say that the total cost function is subadditive, which means that, for example, one firm producing Q1 plus Q2. Okay, so TC Q1 plus Q2 is the total cost when one firm produces this total output, is less than having two separate firms, one producing Q1 and one producing Q2. Okay, in math, we call that a subadditive function. And that's exactly what we have here. It is cheaper to have one firm producing Q1 plus Q2 than to have two firms, one producing Q1 and one producing Q2. And again, good news for consumers, because this might translate into lower price. So there are often some essay questions about whether a monopoly is good or bad for consumers. We've already mentioned reasons for which it's bad, but this is definitely the existence of economies of scale is definitely something that mitigates the adverse effects, the negative effects of monopoly power. So of course, this depends on whether, and this is a good evaluative comment that you can make, whether or not a monopoly is good for consumers depends on the size of economies of scale, whether they are small or large. This is one way you can explain that, and I like to represent it this way. Let's say that we want to produce 100 units. Okay, that's what we want to produce, 100 units. And let's say that we have two ways to do it. We can either just get one single firm to produce it. Okay, so of course, if one single firm produces 100 units, the average cost is $5. Okay, but if we get 10 firms to produce 10 units each, okay, I repeat, 10 firms producing 10 units each, so that's still 100 overall, then each of them would have an average cost of $20. So now I can actually compare the total cost. If we produce with one single firm, so the total cost would be $500. Okay, $5 times 100, no problem. If we produce 100 units with 10 small firms, the total cost would be $2,000. Okay, $20 the average cost times 10. So this is the total cost of producing 10 units. And of course, we multiply these 10 times because we have 10 firms doing that. So you see that in this case, there are very substantial economies of scale. You see that the average cost is downward sloping. And clearly, it is cheaper, which means that we use less resources if we produce these 100 units with one single firm rather than with 10 small firms. And because the cost is much lower, well, the price for consumers might also be lower. So yeah, the total cost of producing 100 units, one single firm, is much lower than 10 times the total cost of producing 10 units. So the total cost function is subadditive. Well, students don't need to know this keyword, okay? Skip it, but just they should get the idea what it means. Okay, and final thing, which is of course closely related to economies of scale, natural monopoly. And as I said, I removed the part that is about the regulation, the price regulation of natural monopoly, because it makes more sense to save it for the next chapter. The definition is actually quite simple, but then it's important to be able to explain it properly. So this is how I explain it, step by step. There are some industries in which there are very, very substantial economies of scale. IEOS is for internal economies of scale, okay? Because we studied internal and external. Of course, when we talk about natural monopolies, we are talking about internal economies of scale. And in these industries, there is a massive first mover advantage. So if your students study business, they know what this is, first mover advantage. And actually, I gave the definition in the, all right, first mover advantage. Here's the definition. It's a competitive advantage gained by the firm that first introduces a product or service to the market. Okay. So yeah, you are the first in the market, and then that gives you a lot of very strong advantage compared with all the other firms who will try to compete with you in the future. That's what we call an FMA, first mover advantage. Why? Why is this the case? Let's try to understand why this gives a big first mover advantage. Well, because if you are the first to do something, okay, so you enter the market, you are the only one, because let's say that's something new, so there is nobody else. And in that industry, there are very substantial economies of scale. So because you are the only one in the market, well, you will supply the entire market demand. And therefore, you will produce a large level of output, of course. If there are very substantial economies of scale and you produce a lot of output, well, that means that your average cost of production is going to be very low. Now, if new firms say, hey, this market is actually pretty cool, I would like to enter and I would like to compete with this firm inside the market. Okay. It's actually very complicated for them, because usually when a business enters a market, it starts with a small market share. Okay, you don't enter the market and right away you don't have a 50% of market shares. Usually the business will enter the market, start with a small market share, and if it is successful, its market share will grow over time. Okay, but this means that at first, potential entrants, firms who want to enter the market, they know that they will first have a small scale of production. A small scale of production means a high average cost, because they cannot take advantage of economies of scale. They cannot fully exploit economies of scale because they produce a low level of output, which means that they will suffer from a cost disadvantage. New entrants will have a much higher cost of production than the original firm, the first mover. What does it mean? It means that the first mover can implement what we call predatory pricing, which means you charge a low price, so you kill your competitors. Can it do that? Yes, because it has a much lower cost of production. So if you are considering whether or not to enter the market, okay, you say, oh, wow, there is already this firm inside the market. It has a very low cost of production. Should I enter? If I enter, I will first produce a small output, and therefore I will have a high cost of production, which means that the first mover will be able to charge a much lower price than I could, and therefore I will not be successful, and I will basically go bankrupt. So should I enter? No. And at the end of the day, what's going to happen? Nobody is going to enter because they all anticipate that they will not be able to compete with the firm who is already in the market. So this first mover is going to remain alone in the market, will remain the only seller in the market because nobody dares to enter and compete with it because they all know that they will not be able to be as competitive as this first mover due to a small scale of production. Okay, potential entrants will choose not to enter, allowing the first entrant or the first mover to maintain its monopoly position, which means that it is the existence of economies of scale that act as an effective barrier to entry. And that's what we call a natural monopoly, a monopoly created and sustained by substantial economies of scale. So you see, it's not something that is created by the government. It's not about patents. It's not, it's just that there is one single firm and it will remain alone because it is able to produce at a much lower cost than anybody who would try to enter and compete with it. Careful, because sometimes natural monopolies are also public monopolies. And it's actually often the case. So it's possible. A natural monopoly can very well be a public monopoly, a monopoly controlled by or a state-owned monopolist. Okay, but here the definition of natural monopoly should really be related to economies of scale. We have a single firm because nobody else can compete with this first mover, essentially. And it's often true in network industries. Any output, usually services, that involve very high startup costs, like water, gas, electricity, railways, road. There is a huge fixed cost. If you want to deliver gas to the people in a city, you have to build all the pipes. Same thing if you want to deliver to produce electricity and transport electricity. There is a huge startup cost to build all the cables. Same thing for water, for the internet, for roads. So in that case, because there is such a high startup cost, the average cost tends to be downward sloping. For a very low level of output, there is a massive, very high average cost of production. But as the level of output increases, you can basically spread that fixed cost on more and more units. That's the basic idea. And therefore, your average cost will decrease a lot. There will be substantial economies of scale. Graphically, how do we represent a natural monopolist? Because you could say, all right, but how different is it from this? Because that's a monopoly. Is this a natural monopoly? Yes or no? Well, usually when we graph a natural monopoly, we consider that the economies of scale are so important that the average cost is just always decreasing. Okay, if you look at the long run average total cost, you see that is always downward sloping. Eventually, it will start to increase. Yes. If I continue drawing the diagram, it may do something like this. maybe, but we don't care. Why? Because you see that this level of output that we call the minimum efficient scale of production is so large that it's just irrelevant. Because basically everything that is beyond this point is just irrelevant. That's irrelevant. Why? Because this is what we call the maximum size, market size. This would be the quantity demanded if the price was 0. Okay, so the quantity produced, the quantity consumed will never be more than that. So everything that happens beyond that level of output is irrelevant. So the point is that the average cost is decreasing over the relevant range of output, always. The marginal cost, we don't really care. The marginal cost can be increasing, and actually you see that it is. You see that it becomes increasing after this point here. But of course, because the average cost is always decreasing, then the marginal cost should always be below the average cost. Yeah, of course, the marginal cost will cut the average cost in its minimum. Okay, we would have something like that. It's very ugly, but you get the idea. But again, we don't care. We don't care about what happens after this level of output because it's just irrelevant. So, and you can just show the equilibrium just like in a typical monopoly. It's exactly the same. It's exactly the same, no problem. Profit is maximized where MC is equal to MR. Okay. This is the price that's going to be charged by the natural monopolist. This area represents the profit, and this big area represents the dead weight loss. This would be the allocatively efficient level of output, where the demand, I forgot to mention that, but of course that's the demand. Okay, the average revenue is the demand curve. This is also the marginal benefit of consumption. Okay, marginal cost is equal to marginal benefit. This is the allocatively efficient level of output. So of course, in this case, this would be a natural monopoly that is not regulated. Okay, you know that we can implement average cost or marginal cost pricing to regulate these natural monopolies and to improve efficiency. But this is something that we will see in the next chapter. So again, essentially, what's the difference between the two diagrams? There is only one difference. If your students want to graph a natural monopoly, they have to make sure that the average cost is always decreasing. And so the marginal cost must always be below the average total cost. And that's what I explain here. Yes. Right here. So the long run average cost is always downward sloping over the relevant range of output. Okay. And therefore, the marginal cost is always below the long run average total cost. That's about it. Only difference. Okay, and I'm done. So as always, you will find a summary, 3 pages, sorry, only 3 pages, and everything about all your students must know about monopoly. It's there. Definitions, only 4. Not many. And concept cards to review. I don't know, do you guys use the concept cards to review with your students? I actually like it. Actually, that's the first year I really do it at the end of every chapter. So I just cut them. I put them on my desk. I hide the concept, of course. So I flip them. And then they pick one and they have to explain the content in front of the entire class. And it works well. It works really well with my students. So I don't know if you've tried, but I feel like it's a great way to review. And here we have 2 drawing challenges, a snowman and a reindeer. Okay. And that concludes this PPT on monopoly. A drawing challenge material is just, they don't have to explain anything. They just have to draw something on the board. That's just one way to relax a bit during the lessons. Just absolutely, just some fun. Just to add some humor and just to relax a bit during the lesson. That's it. You can adapt it. Last year, I used a combination of drawing challenges and singing challenges, but I realized that some students, they were just way too shy to sing, even a simple melody, right? Even a simple melody in front of their classmates. So I said, okay, maybe I should find something that's not going to embarrass them. And a drawing challenge is, yeah, everybody can do it, even if, and sometimes the drawing are pretty funny, and that just relaxes the atmosphere, and then everyone can become focused and pay attention and be in a good mood. So I like that. I like these drawing challenges. Okay, good. No questions? Should we move forward? Price discrimination is actually very short. They are more, well, it should not take us too much time. So same thing for price discrimination. You will have you actually have a summary, only 2 pages for price discrimination. You have same thing, concept cards. The drawing challenge here is Winnie the Pooh. If your students don't know what this is, you can just show them quickly on the internet. And definitions, but again, I don't think there are so many definitions. Quite a bit more, yes. Few definitions. Actually, the last one, you can remove it because it's not often tested. Okay, so these are all the premium resources that you will have access to. Okay, let's get started. Let's talk about price discrimination. Did I change anything? I don't think so. Don't say. Right. Unfortunately, there are a lot of misconceptions about price discrimination and a lot of mistakes, even by Cambridge. So I will try to explain my view, and it's not really my view, just what is right, honestly. Okay. So price discrimination, what it is just selling the same product at different prices. By same product, there are actually 2 things we mean. So we have to be careful because, again, when talking about the same product, we talk about the characteristics. Yes, the products that are sold at different prices must have the exact same characteristics. 2 people should be completely indifferent between the 2 products if they were sold at the same price. Okay, it's exactly the same thing. But we also mean that the production costs must be the same. Okay, because of course, if one product is more expensive to produce, it makes sense that it's going to be more expensive. Example: if you take 2 products that are identical, let's say an iPad. Okay, if you take an iPad in France and an iPad in the US, they are the same. They have the same characteristics, right? But simply because taxes might not be the same, taxes on businesses might not be the same, it means that it might actually, the price might be higher, let's say in France, if taxes are higher, or could be if you produce something in France and of course the minimum wage is higher than the minimum wage in let's say Poland. So again, if you pay workers a higher wage in France than in Poland, even if they produce the same product, your cost of production is going to be higher. So it makes sense to have a higher price. So price discrimination, you sell the same product at different prices. Same product means same characteristics and same production costs. Okay. Very important point, and that's what I meant when I said there are a lot of mistakes about price discrimination. Charging different prices for the same product at different points in time or at different locations should not be regarded as price discrimination, but simply as the consequence of changes or differences in supply or demand. And the best way to explain that is to use a few examples. So what's next is just a few examples, but okay. Before we go through the examples, one last point: a firm which implements price discrimination, we call it a price discriminating firm. What is the opposite of price discrimination? We call that uniform pricing. Uniform pricing is when you sell the same price, sorry, you charge the same price to all consumers. So the opposite of price discrimination. Okay, shall we do this together? In what's next, I have 8 examples, and you should tell me if this is price discrimination or not. Are you ready? Please do it with me. Just type yes if you think that's price discrimination. Just type yes in the chat box, and type no if you think that this is not price discrimination, and a question mark if you don't know. How about this one? So I took this picture in a bar last year, and you see that the price of the beer is not the same before 9 p.m. and after 9 p.m. It's cheaper before 9 p.m. Is this price discrimination? Yes or no? So Mitchell, yes. No, Caitlin. Does anybody else wants to contribute? So one of you is right. Okay. Actually, it's not price discrimination. Again, it's just changes in supply and demand. There are usually more people in bars after 9 p.m. So there is a higher demand after 9 p.m. And therefore, with a higher demand, the price is higher. That's it. Before 9 p.m., the demand for beer is usually much lower, and therefore the price is lower. That's it. That's exactly what I meant by saying charging different prices for the same product at different points in time should not be regarded as price discrimination, but simply as the consequences of changes in supply and demand. Okay? So that's a common misconception. Example number 2. So not price discrimination, just more demand after 9 p.m. So this one is an interesting example. Maybe you know that last week I worked on making a video resume, and in order to create it, I purchased this software. It's called Movavi Video Editor, and I noticed something quite interesting. Depending on the language that I chose on the website, there were very different prices. If I chose, let's say, yes, that's French. So the top picture is so that's the same page, but just different languages, okay? So this is the French website. So I purchased this one. Okay, let's look at this one. So 32 euros. 32 euros, it's about 250 RMB. Okay, about that. 250 RMB. A bit less, 220. And this is the Chinese version. 99 RMB. That's much cheaper, right? It's the same product. Definitely the same product. Video Editor Plus, 1-year license. So the software is exactly the same. Is this price discrimination? This one is a bit more tricky. Okay. So the language in well, here I would argue. Well, again, yeah, of course, if you pay in euros, then you should you should be able to pay with an account in euros, and if you buy in RMB, then you should be able to pay in RMB. This one is a bit tricky, and it's an interesting case because it really depends on whether only people in France can actually purchase this version and only people in China can buy this version. If this is the case, if you can't choose, essentially, if you are in France, if you must buy this one, and if you are in China, you must buy this one, then this would actually not really be price discrimination. This would simply be two products sold at different prices in different locations. And simply because in France, on average, the people might be willing to pay a higher price because on average they have more income, or maybe because there is a higher VAT. You see the difference? Here it's a VAT included. In China, there is no information. So maybe the price is different because if you buy the software from the French website, the company has to pay more tax than if you buy the product from the Chinese website. So if this is the case, this would not be price discrimination. You would simply pay more on the French website because the company has to pay more taxes. Maybe, okay? Or you could say that maybe the price is lower on the Chinese website, simply because in China, on average, people have less income, and therefore the demand is likely to be lower. The willingness to pay is going to be lower in China than in France. If this is the reason, then this would not be price discrimination. The price would be lower on the Chinese website simply because the willingness to pay of Chinese residents is lower than the willingness to pay of French residents. Maybe. So it's a bit difficult to tell. I would argue that this is not price discrimination because there might be just differences in taxation between France and China. And because this might simply be, again, the fact that the demand in France is not the same as the demand in China. Lower demand in China, lower willingness to pay, and therefore lower price. But this one is a bit tricky, and does it relate to credit card charges? I don't know. I don't know, actually. I just found that this was an interesting example that should be discussed. Are there differences in credit? Because even on the Chinese website, you can pay with Union Pay. Are there charges? I don't know the details, honestly. I know the language of the software. For example, I purchased the Chinese version and the software is in English. So, and I can choose the language on the software. But yeah, it's an interesting example. I wouldn't consider this, I would not consider this as price discrimination. I would say perhaps differences in taxes that would justify differences in prices, and differences in location. Remember, if we go back a bit, charging different prices for the same product at different locations should not be regarded as price discrimination. You know, another example is location is also something that can have an influence on the price of the product. If you go to the Great Wall and if you take a walk on the Great Wall, the further you go, the more expensive water bottles become. If you are very close to the bus station, for example, a bottle of water is going to be very cheap. But if you have walked on the Great Wall for 10 kilometers and there is not many people around and there is one single business that sells water, it's going to get very expensive. So yes, location can also affect the price of product. But okay, this one is interesting, a bit tricky to say if it's price discrimination or not. Look at this one. So here I have two plane tickets. That's the same flight. Exactly the same flight. So it's a one-way economy ticket from Paris to Montpellier. That's my hometown in France. You can see the flight number here. It's the same aircraft. So everything is the same travel time, same departure time, exactly the same thing. The only thing that changes is the date. So the top one lives on Tuesday, November 23rd, and the bottom one, Tuesday, December 14th. And actually, you see something that is quite interesting. because we often say that it's cheaper to purchase plane tickets in advance. Not always. It's often true. But you see, for example, these are real prices that I found on the website. It's actually cheaper to buy the plane ticket that leaves on the next month than the flight ticket that leaves in 2 months from now. Okay, so would this be an example of price discrimination? So I hear 2 no's. Yes, clearly here it's not price discrimination. Clearly not. Simply because, again, even if this is the same flight, first it is a flight that takes place at 2 different points in time. Okay, and you may have more people who want to fly in December than people who want to fly in November. Okay, possibly it's possible that the demand for the second flight is much higher. It's just before the holiday. Maybe there are a lot of people who want to travel just before the holiday. Maybe the cost of production are not the same. We don't know. Maybe airlines, they anticipate that the price of kerosene, which is the fuel for planes, is going to be higher in December. So they anticipate that they might charge higher price tickets. And simply, the demand at each point in time changes over time. Okay, maybe right now there are a lot of people who want to book flights for December, so there is a high demand for December flights today, and there are fewer people who want today to book flights for next month. So maybe the demand for November flights today is very low, so the price is lower. Okay, so this should not be regarded as price discrimination. That's good. How about this one? So this one is these are the price of tickets for a cruise in New Zealand. There is a place called Milford Sounds in New Zealand, and you can book a cruise. So there are 2 things that we should see here. First, you see that they are for each time slot. Let's say if we look at Tuesday, for the 11:10 departure, you see that there are 3 prices: adult, child, and infant. And there are also different days and different departure times where you have different prices. So let's just do that step by step. If we look at one departure, let's say Tuesday, 11:10 a.m., there are 3 prices for adult, child, and infant. Is this price discrimination? I have 1 yes. Same departure, same day, same cruise. Yes, I agree with you, Mitchell. In that case, of course, it is price discrimination. It's the same product, same characteristics, same cost of production, definitely, sold at different prices. So this would be an example of price discrimination. Now, how about the fact that if you look at the same day, and let's just assume we are an adult, and you see that the departure at 11:10 is actually cheaper than the departure at 1:30 p.m. Okay, $59 against $69. Is this price discrimination? Is this price discrimination if it's more expensive to charge a different price at 1:30 p.m.? My question is, you see that at 1:30 p.m., it's more expensive than at 11:10 a.m. $59 at 11:10 a.m. and $69 at 1:30 p.m. Is this price discrimination? Well, again, in that case, it's clearly not price discrimination, simply because the demand is likely to be higher. This might simply be the consequence of the fact that there is a higher demand at 1:30 p.m. than at 11:10 a.m. Perhaps because at 11 a.m. People are about to have lunch, so they don't want to start a cruise because then they might be starving. So many of them, they would simply have lunch and then go on a cruise. So 1:30 is perfect. Yeah, it's the perfect timing. So there is a higher demand at 1:30 p.m. and the higher demand justifies the higher price. So again, this should not be regarded as price discrimination, just a higher demand at 1:30 p.m. Caitlin, your question, can we say that the demand for a child is different with the demand for an adult? Of course it is. But that being said, if we focus on the definition of price discrimination, it is charging here the same, the different prices for the same product that has the same cost of production. And that's, of course, here it's definitely the case. I hear what you say. But still, I don't have a very good explanation to give you. It's, you still charge a different price for the exact same product at the exact same point in time at the exact same location, so that makes it price discrimination in this case. How about this one? So this is the Lion King ticket on Broadway. So here you have the map of the room, and you see that you have different locations, and for different locations you have different prices. Is this price discrimination? Well, of course not, right? It's not price discrimination. It's more expensive if you have a better seat, of course. So if you are closer to the stage, you're going to pay more. And if you are further away from the stage, you will simply have a lower price. So that's not the same product. So that's definitely not price discrimination. How about this one? So this one, it's a train ticket, again, from Paris to Montpellier in France. So you see that there are different departures. And for different departures, there are different prices. So there is second class and first class. Let's just look at second class first. So you see that at different departures, you have different prices. Is this price discrimination? The fact that for second class ticket, for different departures, you have different prices? Well, that's clearly not price discrimination. Well, first, you see that this is not the same duration, 4 hours, 3 hours. So it's not the same product because it's not the same time to go from one location to the other. Some have one changed, other are direct trains. So it's different. You see that they don't have the same services. This one has a bar, Wi-Fi. This one only has a plug, apparently. Electricity, maybe no Wi-Fi. So it's not the same product quality. You don't have the same features. And again, they are different prices simply because the demand at certain times is higher. So so for example, it's very common to have more expensive train tickets around 6 p.m. Because or 7 p.m. because this is when people are off work and this is a good time to travel. Okay, so of course, if you have more people who want to travel in the evening, it makes sense that the price is higher. It's just the consequence of supply and demand. Okay, but look at that. If you look at the first departure, you see that the first class ticket is more expensive than the second class ticket. Is this price discrimination? The fact that the first class ticket is more expensive than a second class ticket? First class more expensive than second class? Oh, of course not, because it's not the same product. Okay, a first class seat is more comfortable than a second class seat. It's bigger, more comfortable, usually more quiet. So it's not the same product, and therefore this should not be regarded as price discrimination. How about this? This is a cinema ticket for the latest James Bond movie. So yeah, in French, it's the name of the movie is Mourir peut attendre. I don't even remember what the name is in English, actually. I don't remember. So here what we see, so this is the same session. Okay, so that's it's actually yesterday at 3 p.m. That's VOST means original version with subtitles. And you see that there are several prices, full price for senior, people over 65, I think, or 60, student, child under 14. Okay. Should we regard this as price discrimination? Different prices for senior, different price students, child under 14. Is this price discrimination? Yes, of course. This is definitely price discrimination. Same product, same time, same location, same cost of production. Okay, the cost of production to produce a full price ticket is the same as to produce a senior ticket, but still different prices. So this is price discrimination. Absolutely. Mitchell, what do you say? But if your friend was looking at the same website at the same time and he had different prices than you, then it's price discrimination. Well, that's a tricky one. Yeah, but then on what basis? Why would my friend have the same website at the same time and would see different prices? You mean for the train tickets? I don't really see why this would be the case. It happens when you book cars travel. Okay. Based on your purchase history or something. Then we really start looking at the tricky cases. Try to keep it simple for your students, okay? You see, among all this, honestly, I don't know, because we could debate it. You see, among all these examples, some of them are really simple. Some of them are a bit more tricky. So you don't have to introduce them all. If you feel like some of them are a bit complicated, for example, this one is complicated. Yeah, you can remove it. You can say, okay, that's too tricky. That's going to confuse my students. It's good for a discussion. It's good for class conversation. Say, okay, what do you think? But it's difficult to tell because we might not really have all the information we need, and we could argue that yes, this is price discrimination. No, this is not price discrimination. So it's a bit tricky. On the other hand, there are some very simple examples. This one is very clear cut. This one is also very clear. This one is very clear. So try to keep simple examples. Oh, there is a last one. Yeah. How about this one? This is the price of electricity in different countries. Of course, electricity, it's the same product, okay? So this is the price per kilowatt per hour, kilowatt hour in US dollars in each country. So of course, it's exactly the same product. Is this price discrimination? Mitchell says no. It's the same product, right? Different prices. But, because you're right, Mitchell, this is not price discrimination, because what's the key ID here? Yes, true. But it's true. Yeah, absolutely. Location. But in that case, it's not really related to location because electricity is usually provided by public companies. So they usually charge a price that is quite close to the cost of production. Yeah, the main idea that I had here was the fact that the cost of producing electricity varies a lot from one country to the other, depending on how we produce it. Do we use nuclear energy? Do we use wind turbines? Mostly. It depends on the energy mix, of course. Do we just burn coal? Do we use hydroelectric dam? So of course, depending on how we produce electricity, we have different costs of production, which justifies different prices. So in that case, even though electricity is the same everywhere, okay, 1 kilowatt hour in Germany is the same as 1 kilowatt in Spain, but because we use different production techniques, we have different production costs, and therefore this should not be regarded as price discrimination. But you're right, location also matters. It's different location, so there might be a different supply and demand within each country. So that's a good point. Okay, so just these are just 8 examples that I found yesterday. Feel free to add more. Feel free to remove some, but I feel it's more engaging to use real life examples to help your students distinguish what is price discrimination and what is not. Okay, let's finish quickly. There is not much left we have to do. What is the objective? The objective of price discrimination is to increase profit. Okay, that's what they want to do. Why can we increase profit through price discrimination? Because basically it's more flexible. For businesses, it gives you more flexibility to charge different prices to different types of consumers rather than selling all your product at the same price for everyone. You can actually segment the market demand. Okay, you face a total demand and you can cut it into smaller pieces to identify different groups of buyers that have similar characteristics. And then you can charge a price that is going to be more closely related to consumer preferences and to how much consumers are willing to pay for the product. And therefore, you will be able to extract more consumer surplus than if you charge the same price for everyone. Basically, price discrimination, greater flexibility, and therefore greater ability to extract surplus from consumers. That's how you can increase your profit. However, and this is something that could be interesting in an essay, we should acknowledge that implementing price discrimination might be costly for businesses. This could be because we have to do some extensive market research to identify the different types of consumers, because we have to design different prices. We have to calculate, to compute what the price should be on each market segment. So this might also generate extra cost. We might have to hire people to check that people have the right tickets. For example, in the cinema, you have to make sure that if you are not a student, then you cannot enter the room with a student ticket. So there might be some extra cost associated with the implementation of price discrimination. So if price discrimination is to be profitable, we need to make sure that these extra costs are not too high. Okay, otherwise you might actually make less profit than under uniform price. Okay. There are 3 conditions that must be met if a business wants to implement price discrimination. Of course, first, it must be price maker. If you are price taker, you don't decide what the price is, so end of story. Which means that the business must have some market power. And that's why I removed it from the PPT on monopoly, because yes, it could be a monopolist, but it could be any firm that has some control over the price. Could be an oligopolist, could be a firm in monopolistic competition. Condition 1, control over price. Condition 2 is about information. Of course, you must be able to segment the market demand. You must be able to identify different groups of buyers that have similar characteristics. So then you can charge one different price on each market segments. Okay, if you can't identify these market segments, how can you price discriminate? So the second condition, information, and that's why market research is very important before you can implement price discrimination. Third condition, the market segments must be separate. So buyers are unable to arbitrage or to engage in arbitrage. It's actually a French word, so that's why it's a bit weird. Arbitrage is would be a situation where essentially you can choose. So, or you could, let's say, buy, let's say you are a student, okay? You are a student, you go to the cinema and you buy a ticket at the student price. Let's say it's $10, okay? And then you resell it to someone who is not a student at a higher price. So let's say, to simplify, that the student ticket is $10 and the adult ticket is $20, just to simplify. So maybe if you are a student, you buy the cinema ticket at $10 and then you resell it to adults at $15. So you make a profit, and it also benefits adults because they can get the ticket at $15 instead of $20. Of course, if people can do that, price discrimination is not going to work, because everybody will just buy student tickets. So you need to have a system to make sure that this is not possible. So just to make sure that the market segments are separate. If you are a student, you buy the student ticket. If you are not a student, you buy the adult ticket, for example, and you cannot trade, okay? It's not possible for the market segments to engage in trades to take advantage of the lowest price. Same thing, I added a definition of what we call arbitrage. Where is it? It's a good definition, actually. It's arbitrage is the process where traders acting as either buyers or sellers can exploit price differences for identical products, buying where the price is lower and selling where it is higher. So of course, if this is possible, then the price discrimination is not going to work. Everybody is going to buy the product at the lowest price, and that's not going to be a very successful pricing strategy. So you need to make sure that this is not possible. Okay, so this is the third condition. The market segments must be separate. So these are the three conditions. Last is something that is necessary if you want price discrimination to be profitable. And to put it simply, you have an incentive to price discriminate if you face buyers that are different. Imagine if all buyers are the same, well, there is no reason to price discriminate. If they have the same willingness to pay, for example, W2P is willingness to pay. If all the buyers are willing and able to pay exactly the same price for your product, and if all of them have the same price elasticity of demand, okay, if they have the same sensitivity to price changes, well, in that case, the best thing you can do is to charge the same price for everyone, okay? Even if you could charge different prices for each consumer, that's not useful because they are all the same. What makes price discrimination profitable is that people, buyers, they have different characteristics. And because they have different characteristics, because they have different willingness to pay for your product, or because some of them are very sensitive to price changes, or some groups are very sensitive to price changes, other groups are very insensitive to price changes, it is because of these differences that you can charge different prices for different consumers, or different prices for different groups of consumers, and take advantage of those differences and extract more consumer surplus. Okay, again, if consumers are all the same, well, price discrimination is actually not something that can be profitable. Okay, so market segments must have different characteristics, otherwise not useful. Okay, this is an example that I actually stole from a textbook. Usually I make my own examples, but I actually found this example in an AP economics textbook. So if some of you have already used, I've already taught AP economics, and if you have used the Krugman textbook, this is something that I borrowed from the Krugman textbook because I actually like it. So this is the market for cinema tickets. Okay, so this is the quantity of movie tickets, and this is the price of a ticket. And this is the demand curve. So the demand curve has this weird shape because we simply have two types of consumers. consumers who are above 25 years old, there are 100 of them, and consumers who are below 25 years old. Okay, and I essentially assume that all those who are above 25, they have the same characteristics, and all those below 25, they have the same characteristics. Those above 25, let's say that they work, so they have more income, they have more money, so they are willing to pay a higher price, $15. And all those below 25, let's say they are students, they don't work, so they don't have a lot of income, so they are only willing to pay $10 for a cinema ticket. Okay, and to simplify, let's just say that the per unit cost is constant and equal to $3. Okay, so if your marginal cost is constant, then your average cost is constant and equal to $3. It's just to simplify. Okay, so we have that. So first, let's say that the cinema cannot price discriminate. The cinema can only charge one price for everyone. Okay, so what should it do? Well, when you think about it, there are only two possibilities. Okay, the cinema could charge $15. Okay, and then you would only have the consumers above 25 that would go to the cinema. Okay, so the equilibrium quantity would be 100 units. And in this case, the profit would be $1,200. Okay, that's one possibility. And there would be no consumer surplus because the people above 25, they pay exactly $15, their maximum willingness to pay. So that's one option. Second option would be to charge $10. Okay, if we charge $10, then the equilibrium quantity would be 200 tickets, because everyone would want to buy a ticket, those above 25 and those below 25. All right. In that case, the profit would be represented by this area, which is actually higher. So you see, it's actually a better idea. If I had to charge the same price for everyone, it would be more profitable to charge $10. So I would have 200 tickets sold than to charge $15 and to only have 100 tickets sold. What's interesting in that case is that, of course, consumers below 25, they have no consumer surplus, but the people above 25, they have some consumer surplus because they were willing to pay $15, and at the end of the day, they only pay $10. Okay, so remember that if the cinema was forced to sell tickets at the same price for everyone, the best thing it could do is to charge a price of $10. And in that case, its profit would be $1,400. Okay. Now, what if it could engage in price discrimination? So charge a different price for different consumers. So of course, one price for those above 25 and one price for those below 25. Okay, you can just ask for their ID card and check their age. So it's quite easy to put that in place. Clearly, the best thing to do is to charge $15 for those above 25, their maximum willingness to pay, and $10 for those below 25. Okay. And in this case, you could see that, all right, then now my profit is $1,900. So you see that through price discrimination, you can increase your profit from $1,400 to $1,900. And in that case, you see that there is no more consumer surplus for, well, no one, because everyone pays their maximum willingness to pay. So actually, this would be an example of perfect price discrimination in which all buyers, they pay exactly their maximum willingness to pay. So there is no more consumer surplus. Okay, so that's a good example to illustrate how price discrimination can increase profit. And also one good example to show how price discrimination can convert consumer surplus into producer surplus, how price discrimination can hijack consumer surplus. Final thing that we have to do is to talk about first-degree price discrimination. there are actually 3 degrees of price discrimination: first degree, second degree, and third degree price discrimination. But second degree price discrimination and third degree price discrimination are outside the scope of the syllabus, so I'm not going to talk about it today. Okay, I will simply say a few words about first degree price discrimination that we call perfect price discrimination, and that's going to be it for today. So what is it? We also call it perfect price discrimination because it is the most extreme form of discrimination. This would be a situation where businesses, they know exactly how much each consumer is willing to pay for each unit. Okay, it's like if you walk into the store as a buyer and it's written on your forehead how much you are willing to pay for the product. So perfect information. And businesses are able to charge a different price for each unit. Okay, it's not even for each consumer, for each unit, the price can be different. Well, so in that case, if you want to maximize your profit, you should charge the price that is equal to the buyer's maximum willingness to pay. Something like someone walks into the store to buy, I don't know, a phone. You know how much that person is willing to pay for the phone, the maximum price. Then you say, okay, then you pay the maximum price that you are willing to pay. Okay, that's it. That's how you can extract the entire consumer surplus. So there is zero consumer surplus and your producer surplus is as large as possible. And because of that, every time you sell one more unit, you charge the price, the maximum price that consumers are willing to pay for that unit. And the maximum willingness to pay is given by the demand curve. Okay, the demand curve tells you for every unit what is the maximum price that you can charge, which means that every one you sell one more unit, your total revenue will increase by the amount of the price that you charge. So the demand curve is simply the marginal revenue curve. Okay, every time you sell one more unit, your total revenue increases by an amount equal to the marginal maximum willingness to pay, which is given by the demand curve. And actually, when you think about it, it might be very bad for consumers in the sense that they have zero surplus, zero consumer surplus. So in terms of equity, it might be very questionable. It might be considered very unfair for consumers. But interestingly enough, it's allocatively efficient. Remember, AE, allocative efficiency, is achieved when the marginal cost of production is equal to the marginal benefit of consumption. Okay. And because the firm is going to sell units as long as the maximum willingness to pay, which is the marginal benefit of consumption, is greater than the marginal cost of production, it means that at the equilibrium, when a business engages in perfect price discrimination, the equilibrium level of output will be such that the marginal benefit of consumption is equal to the marginal cost of production, and therefore there is no deadweight loss. Allocative efficiency is achieved, total surplus is maximized. So it's efficient, yes, but it might not be considered equitable for consumers. So we have a typical example of a trade-off between efficiency and equity. That's how we can illustrate it. So I start by using this simple demand curve. So what we have here is the maximum willingness to pay. Let's say each bar is one consumer. Okay, so let's say this consumer is willing to pay 30, this one 26, this one 22, blah blah blah. And let's say, to simplify, that the marginal cost is constant and equal to $15. Okay. So the first consumer walks into the store and you know this consumer is willing to pay $30. Okay. It only costs you 15. So you say, all right, pay $30 and you make a surplus of 15. The second consumer walks into your store and you know, because you have perfect information, that this consumer is willing to pay 26. Okay, so you can charge 26. It only costs you 15. All right, let's make a deal, and you make a surplus of 11. The third consumer walks into your store. You know this consumer is willing to pay $22. It only costs you 15 to produce one more unit. Let's make a deal. You make a surplus of 7. Fourth consumer walks into your store, willing to pay 16. You know it, so you can charge 16. It only costs you 15 to produce. Let's make a deal, and you make a surplus of $1. Fifth consumer walks into your store, is only willing to pay $12. You could charge $12, but it would cost you $15 to produce one more unit. So it's not profitable. So you would not make a deal with this consumer. So you would only produce and sell 4 units. How much profit would you make? Well, this area, each blue bar represents the profit you make on each unit. Okay. And you see, so overall, this area is the producer surplus. It's also actually the profit in this case because there is no fixed cost. Okay. We can represent it, instead of having this staircase demand curve, I can do this with a demand curve. So that's my marginal cost. To simplify, let's just assume that it is a straight line. This is the demand curve that I face. And remember that if I implement first a perfect price discrimination, the demand curve is my marginal revenue. Let me just explain it again. Why is this the case? Because every time I sell one more unit, my total revenue increases by the price at which I have sold that last unit. Okay, there is not a single price. And the price at which I sell the last unit is equal to the maximum willingness to pay of the last buyer, and the maximum willingness to pay of the last buyer is given by the demand curve. So that's why the total revenue will increase by the marginal revenue, which is given by the demand curve. Okay, they are the same here, not average, but marginal revenue. And of course, the business will continue to produce and sell as long as the price that it can charge, which is given by the demand curve, is more than the marginal cost of production. Just like here, I produce and sell as long as the maximum price I can charge is more than my marginal cost of production. So this business is going to produce this quantity. Okay, I will not produce more than that because in that case, I would make a loss. Even if I can charge the buyer its maximum willingness to pay, it's not going to be enough to cover my marginal cost of production. And look what happens. At that quantity of output, the marginal cost of production is equal to the marginal benefit of consumption, which is equal to the demand curve. And that's why we have allocative efficiency. I should call it QAE to emphasize that this is allocatively efficient. And something that is quite interesting is that this entire area is producer surplus, okay? Unlike a uniform pricing where we had the upper triangle that was consumer surplus and the lower triangle that was producer surplus, here the entire area is producer surplus because of course the price received by the producer is given by the demand curve, and the cost or the minimum willingness to accept is given by the marginal cost. So of course, the vertical distance between the demand curve and the marginal cost curve is essentially the producer surplus made on each unit, just like here, right? This vertical distance is the producer surplus made on each unit sold. The maximum willingness to pay represented by the demand curve minus the marginal cost, which here represents my minimum willingness to accept. So very unfair for consumers because they have zero consumer surplus, but it is quite efficient in terms of resource allocation because you see that there will be exactly the right amount of resources allocated to production. Total surplus is maximized, even if it's entirely made out of producer surplus. So there is no dead weight loss. Second degree price discrimination. Third degree price discrimination is outside the scope of the syllabus, so I am not going to discuss it tonight. which means that I am finally done. So of course you have again the definitions, the summaries, and the concept cards, just like I showed you earlier. Okay. Do you have any questions? Do you have any questions about monopoly or price discrimination? No questions? So tomorrow for the AS workshop, this is going to be the last workshop actually tomorrow. The last AS workshop, we'll talk about price control and other policy instruments. And next week for the 8th workshop, we will talk about oligopoly, monopolistic competition, and if I remember well, we'll also talk about contestable market theory, because these 3 topics are relatively short, so they should not take us too much time to cover. All right, so if there are no more further questions, I wish everyone a nice evening. Thank you very much for joining this live workshop. Again, it's much more interesting for me to actually get to talk to you and to exchange with you. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to send me a message. You will be able to access the video recording in a few hours. And that's it. Good night, everyone. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.